The studio lights hummed softly overhead, casting a warm golden glow over the sleek, modern set of Nightline Conversations, one of those late-night talk shows that somehow always manage to feel both intimate and grand at the same time. The audience, mostly industry folks, a few contest winners, and a handful of die-hard fans, buzzed with low, excited chatter. They'd been promised something special tonight. Not just one Hollywood heavyweight, but two. And not just any two. Will Smith walked in first, as he always did, with a grin wide enough to light up the room and a wave that made half the audience leap to their feet before he'd even reached his chair. He wore a deep blue suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but on him, it looked effortless, like he'd just thrown it on after a morning jog. He hugged the host like they were old friends, cracked a joke about traffic that somehow made Los Angeles sound charming, and settled into his seat with the ease of someone who'd spent decades commanding attention without ever seeming to try too hard. Then Keanu Reeves entered. He didn't stride. He didn't beam. He simply appeared, quietly, almost like he'd materialized from the shadows behind the curtain. Dressed in a simple black shirt and dark jeans, no flashy jewelry, no designer statement piece, just him. He offered a small, genuine smile to the host, shook his hand with both of his own, and gave a respectful nod to the audience before taking the chair beside Will. The crowd clapped, but it was different this time. Not the roaring wave of adoration that had greeted Will, but something softer, warmer, like people were happy just to see him safe and well. The host, a seasoned interviewer with a knack for reading rooms, opened with easy questions. New projects, travel stories, the usual promotional dance. Will lit up immediately, spinning a hilarious anecdote about filming a chase scene in Budapest where his stunt double accidentally knocked over a street vendor's entire display of ceramic cats. The audience howled. Keanu chuckled too, that low, rumbling laugh that always seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. When it was his turn to speak, he talked about riding his motorcycle through the Pacific Northwest during a break, how the rain felt like a reset button for the soul. No grand pronouncements, no self-mythologizing, just a man sharing a quiet truth. For a while it flowed beautifully, the kind of interview people quote for years. But then, almost imperceptibly, the energy shifted. The host asked about fame, how it changes people, how it isolates them. Will leaned in, eyes bright. "You know," he said, turning to Keanu with a playful glint, "this guy right here, he's like a ghost in Hollywood. You never see him at parties, never on gossip sites, doesn't even post on social media. I swear half the time I wonder if he's even real or just a really convincing AI. Laughter rippled through the studio. Keanu smiled politely but said nothing. Will kept going, his tone still light but with a new edge creeping in. "Seriously, man, do you even own a phone? Or do you just teleport places? Because I tried texting you last year about that charity thing and I'm pretty sure my message got lost in the 1990s. More laughter, louder this time. The host chuckled nervously, sensing the turn but not quite ready to intervene. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I have a phone," he said simply. "I just don't always answer it." Will laughed like that was the punchline to a joke only he understood. Right. Too busy meditating on mountaintops or feeding stray dogs or whatever it is you do when you're not saving the world in slow motion." He paused, then added with a smirk, "You're always so perfect. Like you walked out of some old movie where heroes actually meant something. But come on, nobody's that good." "Not really." The room didn't laugh this time. It was too pointed, too close to an accusation wrapped in a joke. Keanu didn't flinch. He just looked at Will, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, like he was trying to understand why someone who had everything would feel the need to poke at someone else's peace. The host, sensing the tension thickening like fog, tried to steer things back. "Well, both of you have done incredible work." But Will wasn't done. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice dropping just enough to feel conspiratorial. "I heard a story once," he said, eyes locked on Keanu, "about how you turned down a massive role like franchise-changing money because you didn't vibe with the script. Is that true? Or is that just part of the legend?" Keanu blinked slowly. "I've turned down roles for all kinds of reasons," he said evenly. "Sometimes it's the script. Sometimes it's the timing. Sometimes it's just not the right fit." Will nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, but when you say not the right fit, people hear I'm too good for it. You know how that sounds, right? Like you're above the game the rest of us are playing. Now the silence was total. Even the crew in the back stopped moving. Cameras held steady, capturing every micro-expression. The slight tightening around Keanu's jaw, the way Will's fingers tapped restlessly against his thigh. This wasn't banter anymore. This was something else, and everyone in that room, live and watching at home, could feel it. Will had crossed a line, not with shouting or insults, but with something far more insidious. The suggestion that Keanu's kindness, his privacy, his refusal to play by Hollywood's loudest rules, was just another form of arrogance. That his quiet life was a performance too, just a more virtuous-looking one. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes or launch into a defense. He just sat there, steady as a stone in a rushing river, absorbing the current without breaking. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the unspoken contract between performer and audience. People began to wonder, why was Will doing this? Was it jealousy, insecurity, or just the restless need to prove that no one, not even Keanu Reeves, was untouchable? The host finally stepped in, voice gentle but firm. You know, both of you bring something rare to this industry. Maybe that's worth celebrating instead of questioning. Will leaned back, chuckling like he'd just been caught playfully teasing a sibling. Hey, I'm just messing with him. We love Keanu, who doesn't? But the damage was done. The spell of easy camaraderie had cracked, and as the camera cut to commercial, Keanu took a slow breath, deep, calm, centering, and looked down at his hands. Not in shame, not in anger, just grounding himself like he always did when the world got too loud. Backstage, producers exchanged worried glances. Social media teams braced for impact, and in living rooms across the country, viewers paused their snacks, rewound the segment, and asked themselves the same question. What just happened? Because it didn't feel like a joke, it felt like a challenge, and everyone knew. Keanu Reeves wasn't the kind of man who backed down from truth. He just waited for the right moment to speak it. The studio lights still glowed, but the warmth had gone out of them. What had started as a friendly chat between two of Hollywood's most recognizable faces now felt like a slow-motion collision. Quiet, inevitable, and impossible to look away from. The host, trying to recover the mood, launched into a question about upcoming projects, his voice just a little too bright, a little too fast. But the air had changed. It was thick with something unspoken, something raw. Will Smith, sensing the shift but perhaps not fully grasping its weight, tried to reset with charm. He leaned back, spread his arms wide like he always did when he wanted to seem open, and said, "Look, I'm just saying, if you're gonna be this mysterious man, at least give us a little breadcrumb. We're all just trying to figure out how you do it. You've been in this business for decades, and somehow you've never had a scandal. Never trashed a hotel room. Never even argued with a paparazzo. That's not normal." The audience laughed again, but this time it was nervous laughter, the kind people use when they're not sure if they should be laughing at all. Keanu didn't smile. He just looked at Will, his eyes calm but focused, like he was seeing past the jokes and the persona to something deeper underneath. "You think it's an act?" Keanu asked, his voice low but clear enough that every word carried. Will hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the silence to stretch. Then he shrugged, flashing that million-dollar grin again. "I don't know, man. Maybe. Or maybe you're just really good at hiding the mess. We all got mess. Even saints, that was it. That was the line. Because what Will didn't realize, what he couldn't see from his place in the spotlight, was that Keanu wasn't playing a role. His quiet wasn't a strategy. His kindness wasn't a brand. It was survival. It was what was left after loss had stripped everything else away. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward aggressively or glare. He just sat there, still as a lake at dawn, and said, "I've lost people I loved more than anything. My best friend, my partner, my daughter before she even took her first breath." His voice didn't crack, but it softened, like he was speaking not to the cameras or the audience or even to Will, but to the memory itself. When you go through that, fame doesn't feel like a game anymore. It feels like noise. And sometimes the only way to hear yourself think is to step away from it. The room went utterly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Will's smile faltered. For the first time all night he looked unsure, like someone who'd thrown a stone into a pond without realizing how deep it really was. The host opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There was nothing to add. Nothing to smooth over. This wasn't a scripted moment. This was real life, raw and unfiltered, spilling onto a stage that usually only dealt in polished sound bites. A few people in the front row wiped their eyes. Others sat frozen, phones forgotten in their laps. Back in the control room, the director signaled to keep rolling. No cuts, no commercial break. This was the kind of television that didn't happen by accident. It happened when people stopped performing and started being human. Will shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat. I didn't mean, he started, then stopped. What could he say? That he was just joking? That he didn't know about the losses? But everyone knew. The whole world knew, in broad strokes, that Keanu had carried grief most people couldn't imagine. To pretend otherwise now would only make it worse, so he stayed quiet. And in that silence, something powerful happened. Keanu didn't press. He didn't shame. He didn't use the moment to elevate himself or tear Will down. He simply let the truth hang there, gentle, unadorned, and impossible to ignore. Then, after a long pause, he added, almost as an afterthought, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes every day, but I try to be kind. Not because I think I'm better, but because I know what it feels like when no one is. The words landed like rain on dry ground. Outside the studio, millions watched live. A college student paused her late-night study session. A truck driver pulled over at a rest stop, phone propped on the dashboard. A couple arguing in their kitchen stopped mid-sentence, drawn in by something they couldn't name. It wasn't drama. It wasn't scandal. It was something rarer. Honesty. Back on set, Will finally looked down. Not in shame exactly, but in reflection. His shoulders dropped slightly, the performative energy draining out of him like air from a balloon. He'd come in as the king of the room, the man who owned every stage he stepped on. But now, in the face of quiet truth, his usual tools, charm, speed, wit, felt hollow. Useless. I respect that, he said finally, voice quieter than before. I really do. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was a start. The host, sensing the emotional tide turning, gently steered the conversation toward lighter ground, asking about favorite on-set memories, unexpected friendships, small moments of joy and chaotic careers. Both men answered, but the rhythm was different now. Slower, more thoughtful. Will spoke with less flourish, more sincerity. Keanu, for his part, didn't retreat into silence. He shared a story about a young crew member on a recent film who'd been too nervous to speak to him, and how he'd spent an entire lunch break just listening to her talk about her dreams. She reminded me of someone I used to know, he said simply. It felt good to be there for her. No grand lesson, no moral, just a human moment. When the segment ended and the cameras cut, there was no immediate rush to stand up or hug or laugh it off. For a few seconds, the three men just sat there, caught in the aftermath of something real. Then the audience erupted, not in cheers, but in a slow, steady wave of applause that built and built until it filled the room like a heartbeat. Backstage, producers scrambled, not to contain damage, but to protect the moment. Do not edit that, one whispered fiercely to the editing team. Not a second. Online, the clips began spreading before the show even finished airing. Not the flashy sound bites networks usually push, but the quiet exchange. The part where Keanu spoke about loss, where Will's mask slipped, where the host sat silently, eyes glistening. People weren't sharing it for gossip. They were sharing it because it made them feel seen. Because in a world of curated personas and viral outrage, this felt like a rare glimpse of something true. In his dressing room, Keanu changed out of his shirt and into a worn leather jacket. He didn't check his phone. He didn't read the headlines. He just sat on the edge of the couch, staring out the window at the city lights below. He'd said what he needed to say. Not to win, not to shame, but to remind himself and maybe others that pain doesn't have to make you hard. It can make you softer, more present, more human. Meanwhile, Will lingered near the stage door, talking quietly with the host. I didn't realize, he started, then shook his head. I guess I forgot that behind every quiet person is a story we don't know. The host nodded. We all carry things, Will. Some just carry them quietly. Will exhaled, running a hand over his face. Yeah, I see that now. He didn't post anything online that night. No joke, no deflection, no great time on the show. Tweet, just silence. And for someone whose life had been a constant stream of visibility, that silence spoke volumes. By morning, the internet was buzzing, But not with anger, not with calls for cancellation or outrage. Instead, people were sharing their own stories. A single mom wrote about losing her brother and how she too had learned to find strength in quiet. A veteran talked about how kindness from a stranger had pulled him through his darkest days. Teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, ordinary people said Keanu's words reminded them that their small acts of care mattered. No one vilified Will. Not really. Most understood. He'd made a mistake, but it came from a place many recognized, the assumption that stillness equals pretense, that peace must be faked because chaos feels more real. It was a lesson Hollywood and the world needed to hear, and yet the tension hadn't fully dissolved, because while Keanu had responded with grace, the question lingered. Would Will truly reflect, or would he retreat behind the armor of fame once the cameras were off? The world would have to wait and see. But for now, in the quiet hours after the broadcast, something had shifted. Not just between two men on a talk show, but in the collective understanding of what strength really looks like. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly and tells the truth. The next morning, the world woke up to something unexpected. Not a scandal, not a feud, but a moment of quiet honesty that had somehow cut through the noise of everyday life. People scrolling through their phones over coffee paused mid-swipe. Commuters on buses stared at their screens a little longer than usual. Even the usual online chaos, the hot takes, the memes, the outrage cycles, slowed down, as if everyone had taken a collective breath. It wasn't because of what was said in anger. It was because of what was said in stillness. Keanu's words, about loss, about choosing kindness not as a performance but as a lifeline, had landed in a way few public statements ever do. They didn't feel rehearsed. They didn't feel strategic. They felt like something whispered between friends late at night, the kind of truth you only share when you're sure no one's listening. And yet millions had heard it. By noon, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times. Not the flashy intro, not the jokes. Just that one exchange, the part where the room fell silent, where Will's smile faded, where Keanu spoke like he was talking to someone he loved, not to a camera. But what surprised people most wasn't the viral moment itself. It was the reaction afterward. Keanu didn't give interviews. He didn't post a statement. He didn't even acknowledge it on social media, mostly because, as far as anyone knew, he barely used any of it. When a reporter finally tracked him down outside a small bookstore in Vancouver, mic in hand, asking, "Do you have anything to say about last night?" Keanu just smiled gently, shook his head, and said, "We all say things we wish we could take back. I hope he's okay." That was it. No grand declaration. No, "I told you so," just concern for the man who'd tried to rattle him on live television. Meanwhile, Will stayed quiet. Unusually so. His usual stream of upbeat posts, behind-the-scenes reels, motivational quotes gone. His team issued a brief note to a few outlets. Will is reflecting. He'll have more to share soon. But there were no flashy damage control interviews, no late-night appearances to clear the air. Just silence. And in Hollywood, silence from someone like him was louder than any press release. Back at the talk show studio, the host replayed the segment alone in his office. He'd done thousands of interviews, but this one stayed with him, not because of the tension, but because of what came after. The way Keanu hadn't retaliated, hadn't weaponized his pain, hadn't turned grief into a shield to beat someone else with. Instead, he'd offered it as an invitation. "This is why I am the way I am. Maybe you understand now." The host called his sister that evening, the one he hadn't spoken to in months after a stupid argument about their parents' estate. "Hey," he said, voice rough. "I was wrong. About everything. Can we talk?" Halfway across the country, a high school teacher played the clip for her students during a break in their literature class. "This," she said, "is what real courage looks like. Not punching back, not winning the argument, but staying true to who you are even when someone tries to make you small." One student raised his hand. "But doesn't that make him look weak? Like he just let it happen?" She shook her head. "No. Weakness is needing to prove you're better than someone else. Strength is knowing you don't have to." In a hospital waiting room in Chicago, a man sat with his hands clasped, waiting for news about his wife's surgery. He'd been angry all week, snapping at nurses, ignoring calls from friends. But when he saw the clip on a muted TV in the corner, something in him softened. He pulled out his phone and texted his best friend. "Remember when my dad died and you just sat with me for 3 hours without saying a word? I never thanked you. I'm sorry I've been distant." The ripple spread wider than anyone could have predicted, yet not everyone was moved. A few online commentators tried to spin it differently. "Keanu's playing the victim," one wrote. "He's using his past to shut down criticism." Another claimed, "Will was just being playful. Why is everyone acting like he committed a crime?" But those voices were drowned out not by outrage but by something quieter: empathy. People shared stories of their own. A woman wrote about how she'd lost her son and how, for years, she couldn't stand cheerful people, how their brightness felt like a betrayal of her pain. "But then I met someone like Keanu," she wrote. "Not famous, just kind, and it reminded me that joy and grief can live in the same heart." A retired firefighter posted a photo of his old crew. "We lost 2 brothers in a warehouse fire 20 years ago. After that, I stopped talking about it. Thought it made me look weak, but watching him last night, I called my old captain this morning. We cried together for the first time since the funeral. Even industry insiders, people who usually thrived on gossip, spoke differently." A veteran casting director told a podcast, "We've spent decades rewarding loudness, ego, the alpha personality. But look at who people are turning to now. Not the loudest voice in the room, the one who listens." And through it all, Keanu remained unseen. No interviews, no appearances, just rumors. He was seen buying coffee for a group of construction workers. He'd donated anonymously to a children's hospital. He'd spent an afternoon helping a stranded motorist change a tire on a rainy highway. None of it was confirmed. None of it needed to be. The stories felt true because they matched the man people had glimpsed on that stage, the one who didn't perform goodness, but lived it. Then, 3 days later, something small but significant happened. Will posted a photo. Not of himself. Not a selfie or a red carpet moment. Just a black and white image of 2 empty chairs on a quiet beach at dawn. No caption. Just the image. But those who knew him recognized it instantly. It was the same beach where he'd scattered his mother's ashes years ago. The place he went when he needed to think. Fans didn't flood the comments with questions. They didn't demand an apology. They just wrote things like, "Peace to you," or "We've all been there," or simply, "Thank you for being human." That same afternoon, Will called the talk show host. Not for an interview, just to talk. "I messed up," he said plainly. "I thought I was being funny. But I forgot that silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's full of everything a person can't say out loud." The host didn't lecture him. "You're not the first to confuse quiet for weakness," he said. "But you're lucky. He gave you a chance to see it differently." "I know," Will replied. "And I don't want to waste it." He didn't announce any grand gesture. No charity in Keanu's name. No public apology video. Just a quiet commitment to do better. To listen more, assume less, and remember that everyone carries invisible weight. Meanwhile, Keanu boarded a train heading north. No entourage, no security, just a backpack, a thermos of tea, and a well-worn copy of a poetry book tucked under his arm. He wasn't running from the attention. He never had. He was just returning to the rhythm that kept him grounded. The open road, the sound of wheels on tracks, the space between destinations where thoughts could breathe. As the city faded behind him, he thought about the night on the show. Not with bitterness, not even with sadness, just with a kind of weary understanding. He knew what it was like to stand in the spotlight so long you start to forget what it feels like to be in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, Will needed that reminder as much as anyone. Back in Los Angeles, a young actor, fresh off his first big role, sat in his tiny apartment, rewatching the clip for the 5th time. He'd grown up idolizing both men. Will for his energy, his fearlessness. Keanu for his calm, his mystery. Now he saw something deeper. "It's not about being liked," he whispered to himself. "It's about being real." He deleted a draft of a flashy Instagram post he'd been planning to announce his big break. Instead, he texted his mom, "Thanks for always telling me it's okay to be soft." The world kept turning. News cycles moved on. New controversies flared and faded, but something had shifted beneath the surface, a quiet recalibration of what people valued. Not perfection, not performance, but presence. The courage to show up as you are, scars and all, and still choose kindness. And in that shift, Keanu's reply, so simple, so human, had done more than shock everyone. It had reminded them what it means to be alive. A week had passed since the interview, and the buzz hadn't died down. It had just changed shape. It wasn't gossip anymore. It wasn't about who said what or who won the exchange. People weren't dissecting Will's tone or analyzing Keanu's pauses like it was a courtroom drama. Instead, something quieter had taken root. Conversations at dinner tables and office break rooms, on late-night walks, kept circling back to that one moment, the stillness after the jab, the way truth had filled the silence like light through a cracked door. Backstage at a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles, Will stood alone in a dimly lit hallway, adjusting his cufflinks in a mirror that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. He wasn't supposed to be here early. He usually swept in 5 minutes before his entrance, all smiles and energy, the human embodiment of a fireworks finale. But tonight he'd asked his team to drop him off an hour ahead. He needed space, not to rehearse lines or check his look, but to just be. He'd replayed that night in his head more times than he could count. Not the jokes, not the applause, not even the awkward tension, just that one look Keanu gave him. The one that didn't say, "You hurt me, but I see you." And in that seeing, Will had felt something unfamiliar. Exposure. Not because he'd been caught being cruel, he hadn't meant to be, but because he'd been caught pretending. Pretending that fame was just fun and games. Pretending that everyone played by the same rules. Pretending he didn't know better. He'd spent his whole career mastering the art of connection, making millions feel like he was their friend, their big brother, their hype man. But in that moment, he realized he'd forgotten how to connect without performing. And Keanu hadn't performed at all. He'd just been there, fully, honestly, and that had shaken Will more than any criticism ever could. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his oldest friend, the one who'd known him since they were kids running around Philly before the fame, before the pressure, before the need to always be on. The text was simple. "You good?" Will stared at it for a long time. He could have typed back his usual "living the dream, bro," or a quick joke to deflect, but something stopped him. His thumb hovered, then he typed, "Not really. I think I forgot how to be real." He hit send before he could change his mind. Minutes later, his friend called. No small talk. Just tell me. And for the first time in years, Will did. Meanwhile, Keanu was hundreds of miles away, sitting on the porch of a borrowed cabin in the Oregon woods. Rain tapped softly on the roof. A wood stove crackled in the corner. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the smell of pine and wet earth. He'd come here not to hide, but to reset. After years of being Keanu Reeves and the symbol, the myth, the internet's favorite gentle soul, he sometimes needed to remember he was just a person who liked quiet mornings and strong coffee. He hadn't watched the replay of the show. He didn't read the articles or the tweets or the think pieces titled, "Why Keanu's Response Broke the Internet." He didn't need to. He knew what he'd said. And more importantly, he knew why he'd said it, not to shame, not to win, but because silence in the face of misunderstanding had started to feel like complicity. A neighbor, a retired school teacher who lived down the dirt road, brought over a loaf of homemade sourdough that morning. She didn't mention the interview, didn't ask for a photo, just handed him the bread, said, "Thought you could use something warm," and walked back to her truck without another word. That small act of normalcy, of being seen as a person and not a persona, meant more than any standing ovation ever had. Back in the city, the ripple effects kept spreading in ways no one could have predicted. At a high school in Atlanta, a teacher canceled her lesson plan and instead played the clip for her students. Afterward, she asked them to write about a time someone assumed something about them that wasn't true. The essays that came back were raw, stories of kids labeled troublemakers who were just grieving, quiet ones who were actually protecting their families, overachievers who were terrified of disappointing everyone. One student wrote, "I wish adults knew that just because I don't talk much doesn't mean I don't feel everything." In a therapy office in Seattle, a man in his 50s finally admitted to his counselor that he'd been carrying guilt over a failed marriage for 20 years. "I always thought I had to be the strong one," he said, voice breaking. But watching that, it made me realize strength isn't about never falling. It's about letting people see you when you do. Even in unexpected places, the shift was happening. A corporate boardroom in Chicago paused its quarterly review to discuss emotional intelligence in leadership. A group of firefighters in Texas started a weekly check-in where they could talk about stress without judgment. A barista in Brooklyn began asking customers, "How are you really?" and actually waiting for the answer. None of it was because of a viral stunt or a marketing campaign. It was because two men, in a moment of unplanned honesty, had reminded the world that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the bridge between us. But not everyone was comfortable with that bridge. A few media outlets tried to reignite the drama. Was Keanu's response a subtle dig? One headline asked. Did Will cross a line, or was he just being himself? But the public wasn't biting. Comment sections were filled not with arguments, but with reflections. Maybe we should stop treating kindness like it's suspicious. Why do we assume someone's hiding something just because they're not loud? I'm tired of pretending I'm fine when I'm not. Even industry insiders began speaking differently. At a film festival panel, a veteran director said, "We've spent decades rewarding charisma over character. But charisma fades. Character stays. And right now people are starving for the real thing." Will heard those words. He read the quiet messages from fans, not the usual, "You're amazing" notes, but ones that said, "Thank you for showing us it's okay to mess up," or "I saw myself in you that night." And it scared me, but it also helped me. He started showing up differently. Not with less energy, but with more presence. At a youth mentorship event the following weekend, instead of giving his usual motivational speech, he sat in a circle with the kids and just listened. When one teenager admitted he felt like he had to be funny all the time, so people wouldn't see how lost he felt, Will didn't offer a solution. He just said, "Yeah, I get that. I still do it too." The room didn't erupt in applause. But something deeper happened. A shared nod. A few quiet me toos, the kind of connection that doesn't need a spotlight. Then, one rainy afternoon, Will did something no one expected. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post a video. He simply walked into a small motorcycle shop on the edge of town, a place he knew Keanu sometimes visited when he was in the area. The owner, a grizzled man with grease-stained hands and a soft spot for old bikes, looked up from under a Harley's hood. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Will took off his sunglasses. "I'm looking for someone. Not to talk to the world, just to talk." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the back. "He's in the garage, working on a 72 Norton." Will walked through the open bay doors, the smell of oil and metal filling his nose. And there he was, Keanu, sleeves rolled up, focused on the engine in front of him, completely absorbed. He didn't look up right away. He finished tightening a bolt, wiped his hands, then turned. For a second, neither spoke. Then Keanu smiled. Not the polite one from the show, but a real one, warm and unhurried. "Hey," Will exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. "Hey, no cameras. No audience. No script. Just two men standing in the quiet hum of a garage, finally ready to be human together." The garage smelled of oil, old leather, and rain-damp concrete. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of afternoon that made the world feel wrapped in cotton, muffled, slow, safe. Will stood just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched like he wasn't sure he belonged there. Keanu wiped his hands on a rag, set it down on the workbench, and walked over without a word. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't force a hug, just stood a few feet away, quiet, waiting. "I didn't come here for an interview," Will said finally, voice softer than usual, stripped of its usual polish. "And I'm not here for forgiveness, I just needed to say it face to face." Keanu nodded. "Okay, that was all. No judgment. I told you so. Just space for whatever needed to be said." Will looked down at his shoes, then back up. "I thought I was being funny that night, playing the role people expect, the loud one, the guy who keeps things moving. But I crossed a line. I made your silence sound like a lie. And that wasn't fair. It wasn't kind." He paused, swallowed. "I've spent so long trying to be everything to everyone, funny, strong, inspiring, that I forgot how to just be honest, even with myself." Keanu didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way people rarely do, fully, without planning his reply while the other person was still talking. "I saw the clips afterward," Will continued. "Not the headlines. The comments. People sharing their own stories. About loss, about feeling invisible, about trying to be good in a world that rewards being loud. And I realized I added noise when someone was already speaking truth. A long silence settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It felt like breathing. Then Keanu said, "We all do that sometimes. Mistake silence for emptiness, or kindness for weakness." He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed loosely. I used to think I had to prove I wasn't broken. That if I kept moving, kept working, kept saying yes, maybe the pain would stay quiet. But it doesn't work that way. The only thing that helps is letting people see you're human. Will nodded slowly. I think I forgot that part. That we're all just trying. Keanu smiled faintly. Yeah, we are. They stood there for a while, the hum of the city distant beyond the garage walls. Rain tapped gently on the metal roof. A radio in the corner played an old soul song, low and warm. You know, Will said after a while, I've met a lot of people in this life, some famous, some not, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who carries their heart the way you do. Not like a shield, not like a weapon, just openly. Keanu looked away, almost shy. It's not bravery. It's just what's left after you stop pretending. That night, they didn't make a grand announcement. Didn't pose for photos. Didn't leak the meeting to the press. They just talked. About grief. About fatherhood. About the strange weight of being loved by strangers while feeling alone in a room full of people. They talked about the movies they loved, not for the fame they brought, but for the moments of real connection they created. And for the first time in a long time, Will didn't feel like he had to perform. He just got to be. Weeks later, at a small film festival in Montana, far from red carpets and flashing bulbs, Will took the stage for a Q&A after a screening of a quiet indie drama he'd produced, not starred in. When someone asked what inspired him to back such a low-key project, he didn't talk about box office or awards. He said, I met someone who reminded me that stories don't have to shout to matter. Sometimes the quietest ones change us the most. The audience didn't cheer. They just nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Keanu, watching from the back row in a worn flannel shirt and boots, gave a small smile and slipped out before the applause ended. Months passed. The world moved on as it always does. New headlines rose and fell. New stars flared and faded. But something had shifted beneath the surface, not in headlines, but in habits. People started asking, "Are you okay?" and waiting for the real answer. Friends began showing up with soup instead of solutions. Strangers held doors a little longer, made eye contact, said thank you like they meant it. At schools, teachers began building quiet corners where kids could go when the noise got too loud, not as punishment, but as refuge. In offices, managers started meetings with, "How's everyone really doing?" and meant it. Even social media felt different, not perfect, but softer. Less about proving, more about sharing. And through it all, neither man claimed credit. Will never said, "I changed because of that night." Keanu never said, "I taught him a lesson," because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't about who was right or who apologized first. It was about what happened when two people chose humanity over performance. One evening, long after the buzz had faded, Will sat on his back porch with his youngest child, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. The kid, quiet and thoughtful like his older siblings had once been loud and bold, asked, "Dad, are you ever scared people won't like the real you?" Will didn't laugh it off, didn't give a pep talk. He just put his arm around his child and said, "All the time. But I'm learning that the people who matter, they don't want the show. They just want you." At the same time, hundreds of miles away, Keanu sat on a park bench in a city he didn't call home, sharing a bag of pretzels with a stray dog he'd been feeding for weeks. A woman walking by recognized him, hesitated, then sat down a few benches away. After a while, she said, "You don't have to be perfect, you know." He looked at her, surprised. She smiled. "I saw that interview, and I just wanted to say, thank you for showing us it's okay to be gentle." He nodded, eyes a little wet. "Thank you for seeing me. No autograph, no photo. Just two humans briefly connected by a shared understanding." Years later, film students would study that talk show clip, not for its drama, but for its rarity. A moment where fame didn't win, where ego didn't speak loudest, where truth spoken softly changed the room. And in living rooms, classrooms, hospital waiting areas, and late-night drives, people would still quote it. Not the jokes, not the tension, but the quiet reply that followed. I've lost people I love deeply. That changes how you see fame, success, even jokes. Because in the end, the story wasn't about humiliation or shock or even redemption. It was about recognition. The moment one man stopped performing long enough to see another, and in doing so remembered how to see himself. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful story of all.